educators. This is Diamond Emerald bringing you another installment of the series PhD with me. I'm going to show you what I did for this round, this update of the review that I'm doing for my research. So let us get into it. And so this is called a specialized culturally relevant education review. It's not necessarily systematic, it's more scoping, but we'll get into it. This is a part of my ongoing work that will result in my dissertation. So there's my name there as a student at UMD's PhD program. This class was conducted by Dr. Cummings in the beginning, and then it switched to Dr. Reno, and my advisor is Dr. Shigapuria, and all of these people, including Dr. Yakubova, have supported in me developing this work. All right, our agenda. We're going to go over the introduction and theory, the methods, the findings, the discussions, and then end with the proposed study I have developed based on this research. Okay, so the purpose of this work is to examine the successful implementation of culturally relevant education in secondary special education spaces. Research on culturally relevant education is done primarily in general education spaces, a lot in elementary school spaces, and is largely not empirical. The disproportionality of students of color in specialized settings warrants investigation of the use of culturally relevant education in these settings, i.e., it's a critical race issue. The research questions that were developed from this purpose are: what outcomes are associated with culturally relevant education for students with disabilities in secondary settings? And the sub-questions are: what are the characteristics of these interventions? Which students are being targeted? What is the intervention? Why is it happening and where? And what are the characteristics of the interventionists? What adults are participating, including demographic information? What trainings are they getting? And the purposes of this intervention. So there is some overlap in these sub-questions. Now we're going to the theory that helps us justify and ground the way that we organize these findings and examine each paper. So critical race theory, as I mentioned, is key to this work. Coined by Kimberly Crenshaw and some other scholars, including Delgado, but these are the two that I'm hiding here. CRT is based on legal studies, which examines the ways in which our legal system establishes and legalizes race-based discrimination in the US, and this transfers to educational outcomes. In particular, Delgado's book on critical race theory, an introduction, notes one of the tenets, which is interest convergence, which means those in positions of power, white people, only care about the welfare of others, non-white people, when it is in their self-interest. So applying this to school systems, principals and teachers care about the education of Black and brown children with disabilities because it is tied to their funding, their ratings, and their reputation. So we've got a critical race issue here. So in application, we think about the questions: in what ways does race play a factor in the implementation of CRE in special education settings amongst the teachers and the students? And what systems are in place that perpetuate race-based systems of oppression in these settings? We're thinking standardized testings, the referral rate for some teachers, in particular white female teachers, in referring Black and brown boys in particular to special education services. What are some overlaps there? That's a critical race issue. And now when we talk about discrit or disability studies, we've got our scholars Sabini, Ansi, Anima, David Connor, and Beth Ferry. So they have a paper, and I've pulled some quotes there. So discrit rejects the understanding of both race and disability / included as primarily biological facts, and recognizes the social construction of both as society's response to differences from the norm. Race is socially constructed, and this argument is disability is as well. Anything that's not viewed as the norm is a disability. And how does that play out in our culture? And the middle quote: neither institutional racism alone nor institutional ableism alone can explain why students of color are more likely to be labeled with disabilities and segregated than their white peers with and without disabilities. Instead, it is these two systems working together. So we look at the comorbidity of not disability status alone, but the comorbidity of race and disability status. So in application to my research, I'm looking at what demographic information was given. What are the settings that these students are in? What disability categories in particular are more frequent? And how is ableism addressed? Some ways that I've seen these addressed in the work is using universal design for learning and responsive intervention. So now we're going to operationally define culturally relevant education and special education continuum. So this little graph is just a theory, a flow chart really, of how these theories interplay with one another. So we've got Culturally Relevant Pedagogy by Gloria Ladson-Billings here. And let me make sure that we're clear who we're talking about. So we've got Gloria Ladson-Billings here. And then we've got Culturally Relevant, Culturally Responsive Teaching, right? We got that from Geneva Gay. We take both of these definitions and we get culturally relevant education. This is CRE, the four tenets of which are academic skills and concepts, critical reflection, cultural competence, and critical discourses of power. I'm not going to read what's in green, so you can pause to read that there if you would like. But this is the definition from Aronson and Lafter synthesis, which I use to ground my work, from culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally relevant education, culturally responsive teaching. We get culturally responsive teaching and the brain, and we have here Zaretta Hammond, who gave us this, and she looked at, all right, and she looked at the neuroplasticity of students. She really connected neuroscience with this idea of culturally relevant education, and so that also opened up a way for me to examine neurodiversity and students' disabilities along the spectrum, because we're looking at how their brain functions. And then finally, we have Chris Emdin here with hip hop pedagogy. And so he introduced a subset of culturally relevant pedagogy with hip hop pedagogy, which particularly looks at the marginalization of students and student groups, looks at their culture and identity, and also introduces arts as a form of expression for the teachers and the students to engage with one another. Okay, so now we have the special education continuum. So the least restrictive environment is a mandate in the IDEA legislation that states students should be with general education peers as much as possible. However, IDEA legislation does not dictate exactly what that means or what exactly these different settings look like. So I've used the New York State's Department of Education Continuum of Special Education Services because as a New York City public school educator for 10 years, I have experience in these settings, know how to categorize them, and it's the New York City public school system is the largest and most diverse school system in America. And so using this as a framework is one way to apply this to the rest of the country in my research. So we have the least restrictive environment down here, which would be general education. And then the continuum moves on up to the most restrictive environment, which would be the special school environment and a special class and a special school to be particular. My methods. Okay, so this is where this is a systematic part of my systematic review in terms of my search criteria. You can pause here to see how I put some things together. Just want to highlight that I use controlled vocabulary terms as guided by the librarian at UMD, who specializes in African American research and educational research. And in general, a lot of my searches yielded very little results. So I had to do a combination of results to find all of the papers that related to my study, but there's not a lot in secondary, not a lot in SPED. And so this is one example, the first round of my Prisma diagram that's in my previous study. So there I only found 7 articles to use, but opening up really the single case design research, which wasn't a part of my scope last semester, I was able to include 10 studies. And so, the anchor texts that I was using were Theory and Practice of Culturally Relevant Education, a synthesis across research across content areas by Aronson and Lafter. That's 2016, by the way. And their research was key to identify different subject areas. And I was able to do a hand search and find one of their papers that was included that could be tailored to my work. And then the systematic review of single case research examining culturally responsive behavior intervention in schools was really beautiful because I was able to find single case research and was able to garner 2 more studies from that review. I didn't capture the systematic review for the first the article from the first systematic review, the first round, because I had a limit for dates for the last 10 years. But I realized because their research did not include students with disabilities, I didn't need to limit it. I could go far and use the papers that they used as well. Here is my IOA plans and plans to work on that with a fellow student. And these, as of now, are the 10 studies that were included. Findings. All right, so my research question, what outcomes are associated with culturally relevant education for students with disabilities in secondary settings? So here's a graph of just the different outcomes. I categorized them by academic or behavioral. As you can see, the majority of the studies were academic interventions. The behavioral interventions included the single case ones in particular. When we're doing single case empirical studies, that usually involves behavioral interventions. But you can see here some of the academic data that we gathered were state test scores, student presentations, student work completion, and overall engagement with local and national politics. All right, and so what are the characteristics of these interventions? Who, what, where, and why? We've got some more some graphs here to share the data. So where, the majority of these interventions are in the resource room, but only by a little bit. There was only one self-contained study that was not included in the research I did the first round, so I was really happy to find that. But that is still the most represented, with special school 20%, gen ed 20%, and ICT 20%, keeping in mind the total number is 10. The CRE markers, these are also charted in my paper itself, but here's a bar graph to display what CRE markers were represented. This is critical reflection. Cultural competence was the one that was most frequently highlighted. And something of note is that critical discourses of power is something that's often not represented in the literature, because teachers, it's difficult to critique systems of power in our own lives, to do it in the literature and to do it in the research area that is pertinent to our classroom in a way that relates to our students. But it's something that we should continually be working on. And hip hop pedagogy was the least represented, mainly also because one of the studies that did include, or papers rather, that did include this in my last round, I excluded because it wasn't actually a good qualitative study. It was more like an article. And so what are the characteristics of these interventionists? So there is a range of demographic information given. Only 2 did not report the demographic information of the teachers. 1 could be inferred. There was a lot of representation for bilingualism in the studies. The teachers range from being Black and white, male, female, and Latin. And the studies were, the purpose of the studies, some studies included examples of exemplary instruction, where CRE was great. And then others did not self-identify the CRE practices. So the researcher themselves had to identify what practices were existent, or I used that framework to identify what practices were existent in the studies. And when the intervention was planned, all teachers received the training or conducted independent research based on, like, this is what I've learned as a teacher, I'm going to apply that. So no one was flying blind. Some quick discussion points. So you can pause here to look at each discussion point, but the one I want to highlight is the contribution that this work makes. So this work expands on what Gloria Ladson-Billings started with the Dreamworkers work, and expands the work of culturally relevant education to identify shifts in particular students. So Gloria Ladson-Billings exemplified and identified culturally relevant education and those best practices by looking at African-American teachers with African-American students. My work expands on this by looking at African-American or people of color educators with students with disabilities, who generally tend to be students of color in this framework. So mine is the spin, if you'd like to say. And it also opens up this work to special education settings, which apply to general education settings, and opens up this umbrella of what it means to have a specialized education setting. And the future directions for this research, there should be more explicit examples of CRE in secondary settings, including 12-to-1 or 15-to-1 settings. All right, so now we are going to the fearlessly moving forward section. So my current research. So I proposed, I'm currently working on a IRB approved study to examine the perspectives of special education providers of color in the field with their experience with secondary special education settings. So I've already interviewed some teachers. I'm currently interviewing those teachers over the summer. This is a flyer that would explain exactly what that research study is about, but I'm not posting that on social media. And so that will be an ongoing work that will lead to my dissertation. The gemstone meditations are an element of a single case research design idea that I proposed as opposed to another class. And I proposed in another class where students would get this gemstone meditation and QRE curricular adaptations to see if their engagement in class increased. So we're looking at internalized behaviors and fixing the environment, not fixing the students. And the YouTube playlist on my channel has things like the Gemstone meditations for teachers to currently use with or without the support of myself and the research, and examples of what culturally relevant teaching actually looks like in the classroom. One video here on the screen is an example. So, real research project here on the left, proposed one in the middle, and then at the bottom right is just current resources that currently exist that I've created that are relevant to my study. And happy summer. Thank you for listening and viewing my work. Fear not, shine bright. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.